Blender is an incredible piece of software, almost boundless in what it can achieve with a little effort. But there's some effects which don't come native to Eevee, or at least aren't easy to achieve. So here's a collection of a few shaders and effects I've made to bring new light to what this software can do. Coming into this with more of an interest in real-time effects and cinematic results, I first looked for a way of making volumetric lighting and fog effects more accessible and versatile to use quickly. Pretty soon, new effects came along based off the designs of the first. Simple and render speed optimized to breathe new life into the systems. Most of them are made from simple 2D planes, textured and utilized in such a way as to create these effects on screen now, from the illusion to a beam of light to fog and so on. So let's get into what these actually are and how you can use them. First of all, the simplest is this color fading cube used for giving the illusion of light fading away into light or shadow. As you see, it really is just a cube, a box with an illuminated shader and some transparency. Its mix settings let you define its color and the strength of its glow. Make sure to have bloom enabled if you want this effect to show up properly in Eevee. Turning its strength down to 0 gives this illusion of fading into shadow rather than light. It can be used in scenarios like this on the screen now, where it disappears into darkness. Now this gamma shader allows you to change its fall off. 2.2 is the default, that's what I've heard is the value you want for realistic results, but it's easily changed to whatever you need. If you want to change the model itself, you'll find it's an object-based shader rather than UV-based, so you can change things easily. You can always turn on effect pivot only and mess with the scale and the location and rotation, and those effects work too. Combining that with the other settings gives you a wide range of different styles you can create pretty easily and quickly. Now, as I said, the shader is object-based rather than UV-based, so adjusting the shape of the model to suit your requirements is as easy as just editing the model and adjusting the origin location or the shader settings as needed. Next we have this fake smoke shader, a 2D plane, again with a procedurally created texture and animation. The first of the settings toggles whether or not it's emissive or it glows, and you can change the colors naturally. It has an alpha, making it more or less transparent, and in a similar vein to the alpha settings, you can change the shader's fall off, allowing for the smoke to fade off closer or further from the top. You can also adjust the width, and there's another slider to shade things from the bottom up. It's used for when you want your smoke to stop smoking and disappear, moving with the motion of the mist effect. Speaking of the mist, this selection of settings I'll talk about later, but they simply add this illusion of extra depth to make the smoke and give it the illusion of moving in a direction, left, right, up, down, depending on the numbers. Now the last of the truly faked effects, and again in my opinion the most useful, are the two shaded planes that work together in their effect. As before, they're made with procedural textures, meaning there's no limit of how much you can scale them. And just like the smoke shader, you can toggle them, toggle its emission and change its color, its emission strength. The linear sphere shader affects how the edge fall off works. Linear as it fades from the bottom up, from the outer edge inwards, while the sphere does the opposite, fading from the inner part, the source of the beam, outwards. Beam width lets you make the beam wider or narrower, and the most useful settings of all of them is the fall-off shape. The fall-off shape cycles through a number of types of fall-off patterns, each of them dynamically changing the feel that this light beam gives to you. Some of them extend beyond what's shown here, so you might have to modify the size of the 2D plane they're projected onto, or go into the effect origins only mode and scale the texture down so it fits inside. And of course you can have the light object centered in the middle of this effect, or at the source of the effect rather. All of these still work with the beam width as well as the fall-offs and the different colors and the mist effects, so that's quite a significant amount of variation you can create. But mentioning the mist settings, let's see what they actually are, because you get some nice variation with that too. The mist detail is an effect applied over the beam itself. It can be disabled completely like this, but can also be used to give a sense of depth or motion to the effect. There's other settings to change how the mist behaves, affecting the detail, its size, and how close the mist particle effects appear to be. See here, it's rather a wide-looking effect with many spaces between where the mist appears, but this can easily be scaled down to being a very small and tight-looking effect. The mist settings also have a speed effect, which gives the mist a sense of definite direction, also being used to change the speed with a higher or lower value or a positive or negative to change its direction. This can be used for the effect of wind blowing around, or the dust being blown by wind, or smoke rising because the fire is pushing it upwards, and such things. But this is only one effect, and I mentioned two, so what's the other? The second is yet again a 2D plane known as a light cookie, which is used to create a shadow in the light. Now Blender's Eevee doesn't have a way of making this by default, unlike Cycles, which has its light and light path nodes which can create an effect of this nature. Now here are just some of the appearances that this can instantly generate, but you can make things look even nicer with some extra steps or by using other combinations of sliders. It works by shining a spotlight through the 2D plane mentioned before and using the procedurally generated texture of that plane to create a shadow by its surface. Sometimes note that you have to go into Effect Origins Only mode and affect the scale of the light cookie to have the pattern fit within it. These settings follow similar trends to the ones in the Light Beam shader. You can also adjust the shadow it casts by going into Edit Origin Only mode and changing the scale. Again, as I mentioned, sometimes this is necessary because patterns have different scale. There's also a fall-off and a fall-off shape slider which may have to be modified also if your pattern doesn't initially show up. While both do work separately, the volume beam and light cookie have been made to work together, shining a spotlight through a light cookie onto a surface and using the volumetric beam to bring out the effect. The odd dots you're seeing here are a factor of the preview quality, but can be smoothed out with a larger sample size when you render. Note that both the beam and the cookie, the fall-off shapes values are synchronized to work together. If one is on 4, then put the other on 4. Now here's just a short example of a scene with these volumes in effect. You can see the yellow ones in the foreground and the blue in the background. Now we come to the two particle effects of this selection of effects used to simulate Blender's smoke simulations, superseding it in terms of render speed and ease of use, even if the final result is of less realistic quality. This comes in the form of a smoke effect and a fog effect that can slowly or quickly crawl across your scenes. Both these systems have much the same controls, they're built off one another. And the quality for the most part is limited by the number of objects spawned within a time frame. By increasing that number or reducing the total time, you get a smoother effect overall. But you should make sure to turn down the transparency of the smoke source object, which itself is a 2D plane with a procedural texture, to compensate for the extra number of objects instanced by the particle effect. Meanwhile, since it's a particle effect, it can still be affected by forces, such as wind and vortexes and those other such, as well as collision objects. By changing its velocity and object speed as well as the gravity, you can further change the particle's movement speeds and the directions it travels in. Now this is a modified version of the smoke rising effect which I've decided to include as a default effect, meant for simulating the smoke from a cigarette. This weird glitching aside, that's just caused by trying to work on it while the simulation is playing, let's animate the locomotion of the particle effect source. Just brushing it through the air, waving it around. It's keyframing an animation as it's playing. And now once we've baked the animation, just so it runs smoothly, here's an example of the object source being animated as it moves around the scene. Now just a side note, the gaps in between the points of the smoke are an issue that can be solved by increasing the number of particles. However, if you've got a particle system source parented to another object, make sure that before you bake the particle effects, you bake the animation of the source object and unparent it from the object it was parented to. Therefore, you have a smooth animation sequence that the particles can be rendered out from, and it can properly interpolate between keyframes. Now, as I mentioned, this is made with just 2D planes, as is in fact the majority of the effects in this pack, which means that if they are not orientated in the direction of the active camera, that's a problem. So all of these come with a single active camera empty, this sphere shown here, which all of these are orientated to always face towards. You can see as I move it around, they all rotate to face it. That means that you have to keep this object near to or parented to your active camera in all the scenes, so that they will properly face themselves towards it. You can see if we go into the perspective of this object, with everything facing towards it, everything looks correct and normal. Also note that the particle effects, all of them take the rotation of the single 2D object, which means the 2D object, their source from itself, needs to be in the correct location, that the instanced objects from the particle effect all face towards the camera by virtue of being alongside the source object. And now as you see, by parenting the empty to a camera, the 2D objects all look correct in their own environments, as you'd expect them to be. Now that we've taken you through all the settings available for these effects, let's look at them each being used in a scene, how they can be set up. For this first example, we've got this crawling smoke effect, which we're going to put into effect on the scene here. They still have an animation from when we copied them over, so we'll delete the bake, and now put the source object into its location and rotate it around in the way we want it to go. And we'll bake it just to see how it looks, and for the most part that's the hard work done for this particle effect. We can see if we put the camera down to this angle, it looks pretty good. However, the camera is actually over here, so we need to fix that. As I mentioned before, these each have their own spherical object which they are orientated to rotate towards. So we're just going to move that spherical empty to the camera's location, and then parent it to the camera so that it follows the camera around as it moves around the scene. Now, since the smoke source object is in the midst of the particle effects emitter, the instance 2D smoke planes will rotate to the same rotation of the source object, which means that it all coherently works together to face towards the sphere. So now we can just modify the number that spawn and the start and end times, bake it again, and you can see the result. Of course it's lagging, it's trying to calculate quite a lot of particles at the same time, but you can easily take down the number to be a lower value, or reduce the transparency, or just hide it on preview so it only appears in the render. And that'll sort out your frame rate at preview time. In another context, in another design, by using the same processes and using these other particle systems, the smoke and the cigarette versions, we can create these effects shown here. Next up is a brief demonstration of how the light beams can work. We have here the fake volumetric light beam effect and the location we want it to come from, this window. So simply we put the objects at the window where we want it to be, put it into its position, and then in origins only mode we move it up so it has the appearance of coming directly through the window here. Now going into cursor mode so it can be rotated around what its source now is, because remember we had to move its object source upwards. We can now rotate this around to its desired angle to give the impression of the light coming in through the window. And you can roughly see how it's going to look when we've worked on it some more. Of course, we need to reduce its fall off to remove this clipping issue we're seeing. And now we can see that it's no longer diving straight to the floor as it was before. Perhaps we can try duplicating the object and having a second one at a 90-degree angle of the first. Now if we reduce the opacity and the emission value, we can see that it actually looks pretty decent. Sure, it doesn't look perfect, but it's definitely, in terms of render speed and optimization in those regards, definitely a step up from the default volumetric effects. Now we can duplicate this and use the same effects for these two lamps we have either side of the window. First we'll want to recenter its origin so we get back the point, the source. Move it upwards to fit into its place. Choose the fall off type of the volume we want it to have. Now since the point again is sticking out the top, we can just go into edit mode and bring down the top of the model so that it cuts off the point which we don't want. Just quickly duplicating that to the other one and again falling the fall off, the opacity and the color to match with the light itself. And we have this nice effect here. I personally find it much less clumsy and more controllable than the typical volumetric lighting system which Blender comes with. Not to say it's bad, just for my requirements of a cinematic endeavor, this gives me much more control and allows me to still work very quickly. Now naturally, these two lamp sources, we do want the volumetric beam to rotate itself towards the camera, so we've done just that by parenting the spherical object we've seen before to the camera's location. But let's go to the next step and involve the light cookie effect we also mentioned before. First we'll add a spotlight and align it to the location of where we want it. And then we'll copy over our light cookie itself, bring it down to the correct location, in between the spotlight and the surface which it is being projected onto, making sure that its shadow mode is on hashed, so the light can shine through, and also making sure which the light object itself is bright enough to get through the shadowing which the cookie is causing. Let's scale it down to fit our requirements, and now simply we can duplicate it to the other light. Make sure to remember to take the light source with it. And there we have it, more or less. We can see, going back to camera view, we have the obvious issue which the light cookie is visible. Now, don't blame me, blame Blender, but there's no way of disabling an object's physical appearance without also disabling its shadow appearance. You can have an object with no shadow, but you can't have a shadow with no object. The best we can do is use a two-dimensional plane and enable backface culling, and ensure that we have the correct culled side of the object faced towards the camera at render time. That means that when you're down at this angle you won't see anything, but if you rotate so that the other side of the object is visible, you will see the light cookie objects once more. If we try to hide it, it'll also hide the shadow. If we try to make it visibly invisible, if that's not a contradiction, we also lose the shadow. It's sadly not possible right now, but it's workable with a bit of extra effort. And that's it. Of course, you can do way more of this with some extra time and effort, but this is all the features which are available in the plugin pack, and just a short tutorial of how they can actually be used in a real scene, such as I've used them myself in several videos by this point, all of which are included in the content you have now seen. The poker room with the cigarettes, the bar room with the volumetrics, and so on.
So wait no more and go get the packet description. With it, you will be conquering mountains, planets, the black holes, and many neutron stars. Do not forget in description. Yes.